In the vast skies over a world at war, thousands of aircraft rose each day into the uncertain light of dawn. Some returned bearing scars, riddled with holes, trailing smoke, engines coughing on their last breath. Others vanished without a trace, swallowed by clouds and chaos, remembered only by fading entries in logbooks and the men who once shared their flight paths. This is the story of one such aircraft, a bomber whose final mission began like countless others, yet ended in fire, fear, and a silence that echoed across decades. A story carried not by steel or records, but by the memory of the single man who survived the fall. Morning frost clung to the windows of the briefing room as the crew filed in, rubbing chilled hands and shaking off the weight of too many sleepless nights. The air felt thick, heavy with the smell of coffee gone cold and damp wool coats drying near a radiator. At the front of the room, maps were pinned to a board, lines drawn in red pencil, arrows marking the route they would soon take. The pilot, Lieutenant Harris, kept his eyes fixed on the target circled at the center of the chart. A distant cluster of factories nestled deep beyond enemy lines. The navigator, Sergeant Cole, traced the path with slow, steady movements, whispering the checkpoints he would need to call out in the air. Around them, the younger crewmen exchanged quiet glances, each pretending the tremor in their hands came from the early morning chill. The briefing officer's voice cut through the murmur, speaking of weather fronts, enemy radar, known flak positions, and estimated fighter presence. The words washed over the men, familiar, practiced, almost routine. But an unspoken truth lingered in the air. No mission was ever truly routine. And the most dangerous ones were often the ones that felt ordinary at the start. Outside, dawn spread slowly across the airfield. The bomber waited on the tarmac, its metal skin glistening faintly beneath the first hints of sunlight. Ground crews moved with disciplined urgency, fuel hoses clamped onto wings, ammunition crates thudding against steel, engines rumbling as mechanics tested, listened, adjusted. The aircraft bore the marks of survival. Fresh patches sealed wounds from previous missions. Rivets held tight over once shredded panels. The left engine, always reluctant on cold mornings, groaned as technicians coaxed it awake. The men had flown with this plane through storms of fire before. They trusted its stubborn will to stay aloft, even when logic suggested it shouldn't. The crew climbed aboard one by one, boots thudding on the metal ladder. Inside, the fuselage smelled of oil, gunpowder, and the faint, lingering scent of smoke that never fully left a bomber. Radios crackled. Safety harnesses clicked. The gunner fed long belts of ammunition into their trays, each metallic clatter echoing through the narrow frame. A mechanic looked up at the pilot, gave a tired but hopeful nod, and stepped back from the propellers. No one realized it was the last time they would stand together on the ground. The engines roared to life, vibrating through every bolt and beam of the aircraft. As the pilot advanced the throttle, the bomber lurched forward, skidding across the runway with a weight that felt impossibly heavy. The crew braced themselves, gripping handles, leaning into the shaking metal as the wheels bounced and corrected. Wind rushed across the cockpit glass. The nose lifted. For a brief second, it felt as if the plane might not make it. But the wings finally caught the air, and the bomber rose, climbing steadily into the open sky. Below them, the airfield inched away until it blurred into the gray morning haze. The sun peeked through distant clouds, casting a pale glow on their altitude. The men settled into their roles. Headsets adjusted, instruments monitored, guns checked and rechecked. Despite the cold, despite the fear, despite the knowledge that danger waited ahead. A quiet calm filled the fuselage. They had done this many times before. They knew their parts, and as long as they were together, the sky felt navigable. Hours passed as they crossed vast stretches of land and sea. Clouds thickened, swirling into heavy, layered formations that pulled them into a world of muted colors and shifting shadows. The bomber shook as gusts of wind slammed against the fuselage, and ice began to form on the outer edges of the glass. Radio chatter from the other aircraft came in bursts, static-laced warnings, altitude confirmations, quiet swearing from gunners spotting movement in the clouds below. Sergeant Cole leaned over his navigation desk, tracing each checkpoint with total focus, even as the aircraft bounced hard enough to rattle his teeth. Below them, unseen but certain, enemy radar tracked their approach. The deeper they flew into hostile territory, the more the sky seemed to tighten around them. Visibility dropped, turning formation flying into a test of trust and instinct. But still, the bomber pressed forward. They emerged from the thick cloud layer into a sky torn apart by explosions. Flak bursts erupted like dark flowers, expanding in violent black clouds that shook the bomber with every near miss. Metal fragments rattled against the fuselage, slicing through panels and punching holes in the wings. The intercom filled with shouts, altitude corrections, warning cries, curses swallowed by noise. The pilot gripped the controls, forcing the bomber to stay level as concussive blasts threw them from side to side. One explosion rocked the aircraft so violently that the nose dipped, sending a wave of panic through the crew. The bombardier shouted through the smoke drifting inside the compartment, his voice raw and strained. Another burst lit up the sky just behind them, close enough to scorch the rear fuselage. The men braced themselves for the next impact, each hoping silently that the plane would endure. But flak was only the beginning. Out of the smoke, enemy fighters streaked forward with deadly precision. Their engines screamed as they dove, tracers cutting jagged, fiery lines through the air. The tail gunner opened fire, bullets hammering into the sky in desperate arcs. The roar of machine guns filled every corner of the bomber. Rounds tore through the rear section, ripping fabric, shattering glass, sending splinters of metal spraying across the floor. The waist gunners shouted positions, trying to track the fighters darting past them in lightning-fast passes. One fighter's burst shredded the starboard side, cutting through wiring and punching through the right engine. Flames flickered to life beneath the wing. Smoke poured out in thick, dark plumes. The aircraft shuddered, losing stability as the engine sputtered and spat fire. Slowly, unwillingly, the bomber drifted out of formation, becoming an isolated target. The crew sensed the shift. This was a fight they might not rise out of. The fire spread faster than they could contain it. Flames consumed the right engine, licking along the metal plating, bending and warping panels in the intense heat. Smoke filled the fuselage, stinging their eyes and burning their throats. The once steady hum of machinery turned into a frantic, uneven groan. The pilot struggled against the controls, forcing the aircraft to remain level. The engineer fought to shut off fuel lines, feeding the flames, but the fire had already overwhelmed the engine housing. The bomber flew like a wounded animal, slower, heavier, barely holding altitude. The men coughed against the thickening smoke, gripping rails and cables as the aircraft jerked violently. Panic simmered beneath their discipline, yet they held their stations, refusing to abandon the sky without a fight. But the plane was dying. One by one, the systems began to fail. Gauges flickered. Dials spun wildly. Electrical circuits hissed and popped as sparks rained from the ceiling panels. A sudden jolt shook the bomber as a second engine choked, coughing out black smoke before falling silent. The nose dipped. The wings wobbled. The aircraft descended in an uneven, trembling fall. Inside, the crew exchanged looks that said everything their words could not. The bomber, a machine that had defied death so many times before, could no longer hold itself together. The airframe groaned under the strain, metal bending in protest as the pilot fought to keep the nose up. The ground drew closer with each passing second. The pilot issued a call to prepare to bail out. It was the logical order, the only one that might save some of them. But as the men gathered near the center of the fuselage, faces covered in soot, eyes red from smoke, they hesitated. Jumping meant landing in enemy territory. Capture was almost certain, injury even more so, and the fall itself could kill them before they ever reached the ground. One by one, in voices barely audible over the rumbling descent, the men chose to stay. They trusted the pilot. They trusted each other. And they believed, despite the odds, that the bomber might still find a place to land. It was a choice born not of orders or fear, but of brotherhood forged in too many missions to count. The bomber dropped through patches of thinning smoke, revealing glimpses of forested terrain below. The pilot scoured the ground for anything, any clearing, any field, any stretch of land wide enough to attempt a landing. The fire roared around the engine housing. The cockpit glass fogged with heat and smoke. Controls stiffened, fighting back against every adjustment. The aircraft trembled as though on the verge of breaking apart entirely. Inside, the men took their positions, gripping whatever they could, bracing for the unknown. Their breaths were slow, controlled, shaped by resignation and the faintest spark of hope. The pilot whispered to himself, a promise to bring them down alive. But the sky had other plans. The bomber clipped the tops of trees, branches slashing across the fuselage with violent force. The right wing tore away, swallowed by flames before vanishing beneath the canopy. The aircraft spiraled, crashing through the forest in a storm of splintered wood and ruptured metal. The ground rose up in a blur of earth and light. The nose struck first, crumpling inward. The fuselage snapped apart, flinging pieces of equipment into the surrounding field. Fire exploded from the ruptured fuel tanks, engulfing the wreck in a blinding wave. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then came silence, heavy, absolute. Of the 12 men aboard, only one survived, thrown clear of the wreckage by sheer force alone. Hours later, villagers cautiously approached the crash site, drawn by the smoke rising like a dark pillar into the sky. They found the wreckage still smoldering, metal twisted into unrecognizable shapes. The final resting place of a crew that had fought against impossible odds. Military investigators would later piece together what they could. Fragments of logs, scattered equipment, the testimony of the sole survivor. They learned how the crew stayed together, how the pilot battled the dying machine until the last second, and how the aircraft, battered from countless missions, tried one final time to protect the men inside it. The names of the crew would fade from records over time. The bomber's serial number would gather dust in forgotten archives. But their final flight, marked by smoke, fire, and courage, would endure in the memory of the one man who lived to tell it. Some planes returned home with scars. Some never returned at all. And some left behind stories that live far beyond their final descent.